All right, so today we're going to discuss equitable decision intelligence for emergency management, presented by Spain Global Forecast, the Institute and for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, IDM, and the International Association of Emergency Managers, IAEM. It is an honor for me to introduce this incredible group of speakers for today's webinar. Each of our speakers is playing a vital role in advancing this national conversation of equitable decision intelligence in emergency management, and will share their experiences and insights that will continue to move this field forward. So I'm gonna start with Joel Thomas. He is the founder and CEO of Spain Global, a Maryland-based public benefit corporation that exists to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. Since 2003, Mr. Thomas has supported the design and implementation of local, national, and multinational emergency management, homeland security, humanitarian, and faith-based initiatives in 50 plus countries and in 50 US states and territories. Our second speaker is Chancia Willis. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. She's also a published author, speaker, and equity strategist, and leads the national conversation about the economic, emotional, and mental harm created from racism, bias, and systemic oppression against people of color and other marginalized groups in times of disaster. Our third speaker is Nissim Titan, Forecast CEO based in Tel Aviv, Israel. He brings over 16 years of experience in the development and establishment of decision support systems and enterprise management methodologies. He has a proven track record of deploying successful platforms for the defense, homeland security, state and local agencies, energy, utilities, and more. But most importantly, he's been a driving force behind the development of AI-based innovative concepts and decision-making methodologies supported by state-of-the-art technological platforms leveraged by civilian and military clients in Israel and worldwide. And last, but certainly not least, Sarah Miller. She began her career as an emergency management volunteer in Oregon in 1988 and was involved in her first major disaster response during the 1996 Oregon floods. She spent several years as a 911 dispatcher, certified communications trainer, and communications training officer in Oregon and Washington. She was the emergency manager for the city of Auburn, Washington from 2006 to 2015 and managed 6 presidential disaster declarations there. She's the current president of the International Association of Emergency Managers, Region 10, the immediate past chair of the IAEM Emerging Technologies Caucus, and the president and founding member of Seroptimus International Cascadia Online. So thank you all so much for being here today, and I'm very excited for today's conversation. All right, so the aim of this webinar is to initiate an interactive series of conversations about the development and use of equitable decision intelligence in emergency management, and also to share knowledge and obtain insights from jurisdictional leaders and emergency managers about using decision intelligence models to make informed and more equitable decisions before, during, and after disasters. So now I'm going to go over the purposes and intended outcomes of today's webinar. First, we'd like to discuss how decision intelligence can help address different emergency management challenges, to introduce equitable and inclusive decision intelligence model design theory. This will also be an opportunity to share knowledge, insights, as well as lessons learned from real-world operational experience. And lastly, to launch development of the world's first open source equitable decision intelligence model. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joel Thomas, who will introduce the topic of decision intelligence.
Thank you, Camila. I'm excited to be with you all today to announce the launch of an effort to develop the world's first open source equitable decision intelligence model for emergency management. The organizations hosting this webinar are just the first to tackle this issue, and we look forward to expanding this effort over time with many of you. In an era where disasters of all kinds are wreaking havoc on humanity, we've seen that programs focused on preparedness, mitigation, and outcomes for disaster survivors are not always equitable. But we can change that. It starts with understanding the makeup of our communities and the nexus between social and economic vulnerability, social capital, and the impacts of emergency management decisions. Currently, many decisions are being based on frameworks, systems, policies, programs that are not designed to serve the most vulnerable at scale. Unfortunately, the current approach tends to favor some while marginalizing others. Today represents a collective effort to turn the tide in the industry and to disrupt the impact of this human-made disaster that many people face that's only proven to exacerbate the impacts of things like hurricanes, floods, fires, or pandemics. Our rapidly changing environment requires that the modern emergency manager is capable of quickly understanding community needs, including the needs of underserved populations and traditionally underrepresented groups. Only if properly oriented to the conditions of 4 key environments does the modern emergency manager stand a chance of delivering equitable decisions before, during, and after disasters. This requires understanding of pre-existing conditions in the natural, social, economic, and built environments. To do that, we need good data and good processing of that data, and the ability to make sense of that data, and the ability to derive recommendations that are sensitized to the needs of the real people that live, work, and play in a community. So in this webinar, we're going to discuss how human-centric decision intelligence can help. We're going to acknowledge how bias in some artificial intelligence efforts has negatively impacted equity, such as we've seen across the public safety community, and how these lessons that we've learned have directly informed our approach in building an open source model for the community. You have to remember as we open this conversation today that technology is coded by human beings. And if the humans developing the data and the technology are introducing bias on the front end, then the back end recommendations will be biased as well. Many groups that develop AI tend to do it in isolation behind a big curtain, claiming they can solve the world's problems, but delivering incomplete and unsatisfactory results. For this reason, we've chosen to convene an effort that's fully open, inclusive, and crowd tested, so that we can actually stand the chance of developing something that's real, lasting, and that earns the trust and confidence of the whole community. This will ensure that both data equity and social equity considerations are identified and accounted for in the front end in the design and the development, so that the back end insights and recommendations that we get actually serve the whole community. The end goal is to publish an operational equity standard from which future decision-making can be based in the context of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. As we begin, I'd like to spend just a few minutes highlighting some key terms and offering some working definitions that we're using, including some benefits and limits of each. Next slide, please. On the screen, we've provided a list of 4 key terms that we're going to discuss that we just want to set a foundation with. I've asked my colleague, Eric Kent, to assist with this effort as I describe these key terms and we discuss some of the challenges and benefits. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking about this idea that computers can do things that traditionally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, language translation. When we talk about natural language processing, we're talking about when a computer extracts meaningful information from natural human language text and produces some sort of output. When we talk about machine learning, we're talking about without explicit human instruction, computers are using algorithms and statistical models to draw inferences from patterns and data. And when we talk about decision intelligence, which is baked into the title of this webinar, we're talking about a discipline that merges data science, social science, decision theory, and managerial science to support the application of best practices and processes for applying machine learning at scale. I'm going to invite my colleague Eric Kent to talk about some of the challenges and benefits of each of these.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joel, and I really appreciate being here today. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm functioning as an analytic translator for Joel's team, Spin Global. And that's a critical role when you're dealing with data scientists. One of the leading deficits in data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning is the lack of subject matter experts to help translate this data. And we see and interact with these tools every day, or most days. If you've ever used a chatbot, that's a form of artificial intelligence, a very common form of artificial intelligence that uses natural language processing to automate the responses from a prescriptive set of answers. So you have frequently asked questions. A chatbot can then decipher what the question is and give the audience the correct answer. And that, of course, needs some tuning. As well as machine learning can be found in many aspects of day-to-day technology, widely used today in image recognition and those type of algorithms. But we can also find it in work that we do. Joel and I were involved in a science and technology, a DHS science and technology, SBIR, very early on, using machine learning algorithms, multiple machine learning algorithms, both trained and untrained, to automatically surface incidents out of social media. And that was a successful SBIR. We were able to prove that algorithms can successfully do that. And those continue on in products today that you can find available now across the spectrum. While we see these technologies expanding every day and becoming useful, I think we need to really pay attention to some of the pitfalls. Disasters are complex. There is a lot of data to not only interpret and tag, but to create models against. And as all disasters are local, all models will need to have a local flavor. And while we can share these models, like the open source model we're going to be talking about today, for that model to be really effective, it will need to have local policies and procedures that are very detailed. And that's part of the complexity in deploying artificial intelligence in emergency management. Because while we do have a lot of technology, we don't often make good use of it. And I'll just leave here, end this up with a few statistics here, especially around COVID. So in recent studies in Cambridge and the EU, machine learning algorithms for COVID, 401 study over 200 another study, none of them were fit for public use. Artificial intelligence image recognition used in London and New York City, as low as 20% accuracy and 0%. And we can see the hit predictive policing has taken due to the concerns of bias. And so through this discussion, these webinars and this process, especially by including experts in bias and equity in the model making process, we hope to disrupt those pitfalls in our industry, because I think we really deserve good decision support, especially with the type of disasters we're facing today and the extent of events we're asked to handle as emergency managers. Joel?
Thank you, Eric, for your contributions there, and really helpful background and understanding that, you know, some of these sort of really neat, bright, shiny objects that we've seen emerge in the field have offered a lot of promise, like reduction in human error and faster decisions, but at what cost? And we're looking at that cost, and we want to address that cost squarely, looking at how do we do that, but do it more equitably. You know, how do we remove and de-bias some of these approaches? And I think it requires careful assessment and planning and collaboration and cooperation of people from all different points of view in the community. And I think ultimately our goal here is to combine the benefits of each one of these to create, you know, trustworthy model moving forward. So, you know, as we look at moving forward here and for the remainder of our webinar and the way forward, which we'll talk about later, we're looking to develop a body of knowledge, you know, equitable data sets and develop an equitable decision support framework. We're looking to thoroughly de-bias emergency management data sets that already exist and existing models, and create safeguards to avert inequitable influences from learning-based AI systems, which if they're learning what's going on and they're finding inequity and they're surfacing those trends and patterns, it's only perpetuating the problem. How do we actually create safeguards and put that into place? At the end of the day, we're trying to move towards objective versus subjective analysis to make our decisions more equitable. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Camila. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. So before we continue, we would like you to participating in a following poll. So get your fingers ready for a following poll. So it's do you have experience with decision intelligence? We want to get a better sense of, our audience. Awesome. All right, we got about 65% of people who don't have emergency decision intelligence experience, which is great. This is why we're here, to learn more about it. All right, we're gonna give it a few more seconds for everyone to participate. Great.
While that poll is going on, Camilla, it's good to note here what Joel is really talking about. The industry deserves explainable artificial intelligence. And when you encapsulate everything that was said, we need to and demand, our constituents will demand that we can tell them how we're doing this. And I think that's a key component to what we're doing here. It'll be explainable.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, we have about 55% do not have decision intelligence experience, 31% do, and 14% unsure. Thank you all so much for participating. So now I am going to pass it over to our guest speakers, Shansia Willis and Sarah Miller. The floor is yours.
Outstanding. Hello, everyone. I am so delighted to be here. I hope you all can hear me okay. Is that a yes? Thumbs up. Fantastic. Well, I'm Shansia Willis, and as we said earlier, I'm the CEO and co-founder for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. And I'm delighted that we're having this discussion today, because we know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical in all aspects and in every phase of emergency management. This country was built on a racial, gender, and socioeconomic hierarchy where people of color, women of color, immigrants, lower income groups, and many others endure systemic and structural bias daily. And this bias is actually worsened during times of disaster. So, unfortunately, many of these groups have been excluded from participating in policy development and planning around many key emergency management issues for a very, very long time. And so that's why I believe it's so important to have this discussion today on equity in artificial intelligence decision-making, because it's critical to acknowledge the existing bias that has always had tremendous impact on data and machine learning. And we know that there is active bias in the artificial intelligence that has been used for law enforcement and even for healthcare. I was actually reading an article where an algorithm that selects nursing candidates for a multi-specialty practice was only selecting white females. Also, there was a test for skin cancer that doesn't work for African Americans. And it was supposed to be like this revolutionary test, and it didn't work for everyone. It excluded certain groups, or it was found to be exceedingly biased in certain areas. So how does that happen? How does the bias keep showing up over and over? And it's really because the data that is used to develop these algorithms, it reflects bias, and it's capturing that social inequity, that social injustice. The damaging constructs of race and gender and so forth are embedded in our current contemporary data sets, as well as our historical data. So as we've heard today, these algorithms, they have authors, they have people who are creating them, and they are putting together the instructions. It's people are creating these algorithms. And so there is bias, and bias is a reflection of the data. It's a reflection of it. So as we go forth and as we consider the models that will be constructed for decision-making and how the data is applied and interpreted, we must acknowledge that data is not neutral. It has bias, especially if the authors have bias, right? And there are over 155 different types of bias. And lastly, I'll just say that systemic bias, racism, sexism, all of these things undergird American society, and they influence the policies and the practices that are created to uphold that bias. So if we continue to fail to acknowledge the role of those, of racism, of anti-poverty bias, that is so evident in the way that we implement emergency management, then we will fail at equity in decision-making, which will impact many, many of our country's most vulnerable people. So I'll end it there, and I'll turn it over to my fabulous colleague, Sarah. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Johncia. Good morning, everybody. So one of the things that I'm a technologist by nature. I'm also now an academic full-time, which wasn't the case when I agreed to do this, but here we are. One of the things we struggle with on the technology side of things in emergency management, but in everything else as well, we focus on solving a problem, which is great. Solving problems is good. It's what we need to do. But we often fail to ask, who does my solution leave out? Or who does my solution actively harm? And by building better models that are open, we can get better input into that, and we could start fixing some of those issues. And from an ethical standpoint, I think that is one of the things that often gets left out. Who does my decision-making process harm or leave out is the crux of a lot of what happens in disaster response. Because in the response piece of disaster, we do the most good for the most number of people. It's a utilitarian approach. It's a good approach. But what happens is repeatedly, and you can see this in the literature, going back really as far as you want to go, but Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Katrina was sort of the catalyst for this. The same groups of people get left out every time. And so there is inherent bias in our process of how we get to the point where we are helping people or delivering service. And so when we sort of flip these models and say, let's focus on people, let's focus on the people instead of the process, and the people instead of money, or whatever it is that we're focusing on, if we make it a people first decision-making process, we have better outcomes in the end. It's a hard thing to do, obviously, or we would not still be having these conversations so many years after Hurricane Katrina. We'd have fixed this already. And yet we know we haven't fixed it. You look at the flooding that happened in the recent Hurricane Ida, and it's the same things emerge. The same groups of people remain marginalized, even though we know it's a problem. And so using better decision-making tools and better decision-making models can help us solve those problems, but they have to be people-centric. When you talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, it learns what you tell it to learn. And if we have bias, intentional or unintentional, built into our process, that's what's going to come out the other end. And if you've probably heard the garbage in, garbage out, the same thing applies here. If we don't put in the right data, if we don't ask the right questions, we're going to get the wrong answers. And you see this in realms outside of emergency management on a fairly regular basis. You look at that poorly validated models. And coming from the education world, I look at the automated testing software that's used, the programs, the anti-cheating software that are clearly poorly tested, because they often don't even recognize a person of color as existing on the other side of the screen. And that is that excludes those people then from even being able to take their tests. And it shows that the organization did not use a people first model. Either the company creating the software didn't, or neither the company creating the software or the company that bought the software. They didn't implement a process, and they didn't validate their process over a wide enough spectrum of the people who were actually going to use it. So it's poor validation, and it hurts people and harms people. And that's the process that we have to fix in building a model, or building models for equitable decision intelligence in emergency management. We have to have open validation, so people who are using these models can see, basically look and see what's under the hood, understand how this process is happening, so that the data can be trusted. Because sometimes data is discarded because people don't understand how we got to where we are. And by people, I also mean me. We don't know how an algorithm or a process came to the conclusion it came to. And so we don't trust it, especially if it's counter to what we believe to be true. There's that cognitive dissonance piece that pulls in there. And when we read or experience an outcome that is different than what our gut tells us should be right, we have to be able to validate that in order to be able to act on the information. And so building a model that is centered towards people, that is validated by people, that is validated on cases that are about people, will help us create something that's useful and usable by a whole lot of organizations. And one of the challenges we have is we often ask the wrong question, and we get the right answer for the question we asked. And the example that I like to use is if you are using a design model and you want to know how to save the most tax revenue, the most tax base of the property in your jurisdiction, it's going to target you to high-end homes. And if your intent was to indeed save the tax base for your organization, then saving the high-end homes is the way to do it. But at the other end of that spectrum is now you've left out the people who don't live in the high-end homes. And so you have to balance those needs and ask the right questions so that you get to a model that is trustworthy and useful, and can be replicated more or less outside of a machine learning, artificial intelligence environment. We want what we're doing to be replicable beyond what the computer does. Now, with the obvious limitation of it will take a long time to do it without a computer, but we should be able to come to the same conclusions independently that a machine learning algorithm came to. And so our challenge is then to have the right people at the table when we're creating these decision models. So sticking with that human-centric approach instead of other things, instead of stuff, instead of money, instead of whatever else, infrastructure even. If we are a human-centric model, then humans have to be represented at the table to poke holes in what we're doing and make sure that we are on the right track and make sure that we are asking the right questions, gathering the right data, recognizing, as Chauncey pointed out, that the data we have probably has bias in it already because of where it was sourced from. It probably left out or over-included certain groups of people. And so having a broad group of people to poke holes in these ideas, to bring a more balanced approach to the conversations is going to be a critical component of how we create something that can be trusted and used across a broader spectrum of what we do in emergency management. We can point to case after case where people were underserved because of decisions that were made or because of information that either wasn't known or was ignored. And we need to get away from that. We need to get a point where we have equity and parity in our service delivery. And that's it's really challenging, as everyone probably has experienced. it is probably the biggest challenge of this field, is to provide equitable service delivery. And so the hope is that we come up with a model that helps that can be trusted, so that people who maybe don't understand the mechanics of it can still look at it and go, oh yeah, that made me think of things that I wouldn't have thought of, and it produced a product that is useful to all of us and to our decision making and our service delivery process. And so that validation piece and the bringing together of a lot of different minds to help with this is going to be a critical component of this. If we're designing to serve humans, then we need to have lots of humans at the table to make sure that we are not leaving things out and we're not creating unintended consequences. We're not causing more harm than good. I just read an article earlier this week in Wired magazine, for those of you who like citations. It was in the most recent edition of Wired, about an algorithm used to decide which hospital patients, medical patients, get opioids or don't get opioids. And it has some huge flaws in it. Things like, it's taking into account veterinary prescriptions, because those are issued in the name of the person who owns the dog or cat. And so unintended consequences of that are people who actually need opioids are being denied them because a computer said to deny them. And so we have these things in existence. And when you can't see under the hood and you don't understand how the decision is being made, and someone just says, here, ask the computer, and you ask the computer and it says, no, deny service to this person, that's a bad model. And Kevin, I saw your question about what the open source model is. Welcome to the team that's creating the model. We don't have one. The funny thing about this is there's not a lot of incentive to create open source models. You have to really love the project to want to do it. And most AI machine learning models are closed, particularly in this space. And so there aren't a lot. And we're going to get into some of that later, I think. But it's important to recognize that what we're doing is pretty novel. And the fact that we want it to be open source will make some people uncomfortable, because there's a lot of profit to be made in good modeling, but that's not why we're here. We're here to make it work so we can provide better service. So with that, I think I'm handing it back to Camelia to do a poll.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. So before we continue with lessons from Israel, we'd like to participate in another poll. And is equity and inclusion currently part of your decision making? You can take a few seconds to answer. That would be great. Thank you. We got a few more seconds to make sure everyone has an opportunity to respond. Awesome. Well, we got, so far the majority said yes. Okay, a few more seconds so we can share the results. Awesome. We got 80% of you said yes, 7% no, and 13% unsure, which is great. Majority are including equity and inclusion as part of your decision making in your organization. That's amazing. So thank you so much for participating. So now I'd like to turn it over to Nisim Titan to share lessons learned from Israel efforts. So Nisim, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Camila, and thank you everyone for having me today. A little bit about Forecast. We're an Israeli company. We have a subsidiary in the US. Forecast was born with a clear mission to empower people to make better decisions. We develop customized decision intelligence based on AI platforms that support decision-making processes and optimize effectiveness. And I think that one of the uniqueness of our platform is the ability to provide recommendations to decision makers in real time. Today, our platform is helping people make decisions in defense and homeland security. It's scalable, intuitive, and most important, transparent, so people can trust it and to support them as they face and solve the challenges that they lie ahead. And when Forecast was founded, we founded it on the belief that decision makers today aren't properly equipped to make the right decisions. The assumption is based on my firsthand experience in defense, where I understood that commanders have a lack of decision support tools that can cost lives at the end of the day. And one of the fundamentals part of decision making is predicting the outcome of a particular action. If we cannot predict the event or outcome, then we're unable to design or implement effective interventions. In emergency management, we need to mitigate the disaster using predictive simulation to understand the outcome of an event. For example, if we run a flood scenario in Baltimore, we can predict the damage to lives and to infrastructure and how much the recovery will cost us. And then we can try to go from the end to the beginning. For example, the end is the outcome of this flood, of this event. Going to the beginning is starting to ask ourselves what we should do better to be better prepared. In my opinion, and from my experience, preparedness is 85% of managing an event. And what I have learned in defense that is also relevant for emergency management is that better preparation saves lives. That's the major cost we have when we're not prepared for a disaster. And at the end of the day, that's our main mission, saving people's lives. When we talk about preparedness and readiness, we should be able to have a model that measures everything from preparedness of lifelines to readiness of emergency managers and first responders. So our predictive simulation scenarios will be accurate and can mitigate the disaster itself. If decision intelligence AI is not based on good equitable models, it will never bring a good outcome that can support decision-making. Furthermore, if we have equitable models, our AI will be transparent about why conclusions were made, how that information can be used to support critical decision-making, and how feedback logs can be initiated so human experts can interact with the system to make the process better over time, like Sarah mentioned a few minutes ago. To start building this model, we first need to bring operational people to the table and ask ourselves all the hard questions, and just later on in the process, add all the data scientists to the table itself. For example, when we started building defense models, we found out that we were not asking ourselves the right questions according to the event we needed to be prepared for. We thought that we knew how crowd would behave in a disaster, but to our surprise, crowds don't behave according to different doctrines. People behave in different manners. I'm from Israel, and we live in a nice neighborhood, but once in a while we have missile attacks. So if it occurs in the middle of the day, I want to know that my family is safe, for example. So maybe I can behave irrationally when encountering a police checkpoint. This is when we understood we need to add behavior models like crowd behavior and natural disaster models to our AI modeling. Most of our behavior models are based on academic research. For example, our crowd behavior model is based on a research we did with the University of Bar Ilan with Professor Gal Kaminka. For 4 years, we watched how people behave in day-to-day situations and during emergency situations. From a bomb explosion that we did in LAX and from a fire in a train in London. And what we found out is that people behave differently according to their age, their culture, their religion. People from Israel, for example, behave differently from people from New Zealand when they hear an alarm. I will show you now a few slides, and the first one will be 3 options, courses of action. Although it's a military example, but the idea here is how can we mitigate some kind of event? How can we mitigate a disaster? And here we can see 3 different options. You can go through the slides, option A, B, and C, 3 courses of actions. But the most important thing is at the end of it. What we do is we compare the next slide, please, Camila. We compare the different goals, events, and scores that we got for each scenario, and it could have been done here for a wildfire. It could have been done here for a flood. just to see the different outcomes. What happens in scenario 1, 2, 3? What should I do? Where should I invest money? In infrastructure, in building different communities, in saving more lives, in the preparedness phase, and not just in the recovery phase. The other slide I want to show you, and please put the next slide, there's a short film here. This was the earthquake that happened in Nepal, and it was during the research that we did for earthquakes. So there's, if you can just put play on the film itself. So there's 4 stages of human behavior, crowd behavior during an earthquake. And the first one is, you know, when the earthquake begins, you hold tight and you try to find an exit to exit the buildings. And here we're in stage 2, where everyone is exiting the buildings and everyone is looking for someone to lead them. And the first person leading everyone becomes the leader, the commander of the event, until the first responders come, and that's phase 4. So here in the next slide, you can see, please go to the next slide, Camila. You can see stage 1. Stage 1, you can see the red dots is people, how they behave in day-to-day work, in building and offices, on the streets. Stage 2, earthquake is starting to happen, and there's immediate exit from the building itself, and people starting to be wounded or killed. And then if we go to the next slide, we can see stage 3, like I mentioned. The crowd is looking for someone to help them. So if there's some confident guy there walking, you know, it's like you exit the plane and someone is going in confident, you go after him, although he's wrong, but you go after him. So it's the same behavior. And then what happens in stage 4, when all the first responders come to the event? And we found out that all these behavior models are very important and useful. The importance of building an equitable decision intelligence model and how we successfully build such models for defense will be discussed further in detail during the workshops that will be managed by Joel and Spin Global. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nisim. So we have a final poll that we would like to participate in. So get your fingers ready, and it's, what emergency management use case do you perceive to be the most lacking in equity and inclusion? Have preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery, or all of the above? So please take a few seconds to think about it and engage in the poll. I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds. Okay, we almost have critical mass. All right. So we have 42% said all of the above. We got 20 recovery, 10% as a tie for mitigation and response, and we got 18% on preparedness. This is great. Thank you so much for participating. This will definitely help as we continue building the model, and thank you for your input. All right, so Joel, before we open the floor for questions, you can go ahead and recap some of the key concepts that we discussed. That'll be great, and we can start taking questions from the audience.
Sure, thank you, Camila, and thank you all again for participating. Just to recap a little bit of what we talked about today in this first webinar, first discussion on the topic of equitable decision intelligence. We heard up front about some basic definitions that we're using to drive and shape our understanding of decision intelligence. And we talked about some of the challenges and some of the benefits. And at the end of the day, have posed this idea before this community, you know, that in order to provide an truly equitable, you know, decision support in emergency management, that we've got to have trust in the models. And you earn trust by sort of pulling back, opening the kimono, pulling back the curtain, and creating that model and validating that model with participation and contribution of the whole community. That in that way, it'll earn trust. Too many models and artificial intelligence and decision support are behind closed doors, and we don't really know what's going on. And I've seen that working in this industry for a long time. Many of you have experienced that as well. And we're basically trusting whatever's happening on the other side of that curtain. The idea here is if collectively we work together to define the inputs and take a truly data-driven approach to defining equity, looking at the lens of social and economic and natural and built environment, forms of equity to take into consideration, as well as other forms of social capital, and looking at the issues of diversity, inclusion throughout and across all aspects of the input and the data that we're capturing, and making sure that even the data we're capturing, the way we're capturing it, is representative of the community. If we have a good model inputs, then we have a greater likelihood on the outside, on the flip side, to have good outputs. So the idea here is to, build on what Sarah talked about and Chauncia as well, this whole people first approach. Sometimes you get into this conversation and the tail's wagging the dog. It's like, let's build the technology to do cool things. And it's ultimately there to provide a demonstration of something, a cool concept. We actually want to design a human-centric and rationale-centric based approach, so that ultimately, even if we have gaps that we identify, we at least have a framework that we can work with, that we're going to build on and build from as a community, and then let the community take and apply that baseline model in many ways that they might do it for all sorts of use cases and preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery, and across the emergency management spectrum. And we just heard from Nisim, the reason why Forecast is part of this effort is, they've got, a couple decades of experience in operational theater, in models where a lot of U.S. companies are really on the front end of developing these models, and they've got real world operational experience building equitable models that are rooted in academic research. Nisim talked about the behavioral models, taking that into consideration, not just sort of raw data that's demographic. Many people are familiar with the social vulnerability index. It's talked about a lot right now. Harvard's created a social capital index, and I think we need to look at other forms of and other angles at understanding the complete picture, and looking at the behavioral models that Nisim's talking about. How do we take these things together and actually make sense and come up with a design and approach that is truly reflective of the community? So with that, what we're going to be inviting folks to do is, this webinar is very much introductory, and I know there's some questions we're going to get to, and invite you all to submit questions for the speakers that are here today. But we're going to invite folks to participate in some workshops. If you'd like to roll up your sleeves and be part of sort of the design of these models, we're going to be taking some real world scenarios and sort of tabletop exercise approach, and actually build those models together. And we're looking for operational folks, data science folks, academic researchers, across the spectrum, local, state, federal levels, et cetera. And so very much look forward to your participation on that. And Camila will provide more information on that moving forward. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Camila to facilitate some questions. And I know there's some already in the chat that we might revisit. And then if you have any additional questions, I encourage you to submit those on the chat right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joel. I know, Donald Garlick, you asked before to Chauncia where you could get some of the sources. I'm going to include it in the chat, some of the links for you to get some of the information that she talked about. I just added it there. And then I'm going to start here. If you can start adding your questions in the chat, even if you have a particular person that you want to direct it to, or in general, our speakers will answer. So let's see. So we have here from Richard. In human behavior models, what would the influence be in occupancies of high-rise building, evacuations versus shelter in place, as well as in stadiums? I think this is maybe something for the crowd behavior for Nisim.
Yeah, I can answer that. Well, when we started the crowd behavior model, first of all, we started from small buildings, and then it got bigger to, a whole neighborhood. And the idea is understanding that the crowd behavior model is different for different scenarios. So people react differently when there's an earthquake, a missile attack, or a wildfire, for example. But what stays the same is your behavior. First of all, it's your own survival. Later on, it's your family, your friends, and later on, your community, and so on. The main issue is starting to building the model, not top down, but down top. So starting from asking the questions, what's the final score? So I need to save lives, I need to evacuate everyone when there's an earthquake, and see the behavior. And it starts building up with polygons. And this is something that maybe we will present and show the full crowd behavior model in one of the workshops. But it takes in mind all the data. For example, what's the infrastructure? What's the building? How strong are the buildings? What's the infrastructure outside? How many people? What kind of people? We, for example, can interface with the census data. People that have problems, elderly people who needs more assistance, so they need to be close to shelters, for example. If you're young, you can run for another shelter. So there's a lot of questions to be asked, but at the end of the day, the model, when building it up, provides answers to each one of them. And at the end of the day, I think it's 92% accurate. You know, there's never a 100% accuracy, but it provides the best data to make decisions according to how you should react to that event.
Thank you, Nissim. So we have another question here from Kevin, who said, along with the bias algorithms in machine learning, there seems it could be an issue with bad or missing data in an open source model. Who would certify the data? Anybody from you who could?
I'll take a stab at that.
I'm more than happy to, Sarah, if you'd like to, by all means.
So maybe Eric and I will tag team on this, because the challenge with data is the data we're using right now to make decisions is incomplete, and we know it. And so part of this process has to be identifying all the relevant data sources. So I don't know that necessarily I don't know about the certifying of data, but when you start to be more inclusive in your data, you start to see different results. And we absolutely know right now that we're using bad data every day because we're using what's readily available at our fingertips. And we have to reach beyond that for better data, more in-depth data, more broad-based data. And that's going to be part of the challenge of this, is where does the data come from? Who owns the data? Are they willing to share the data? And how do we build it in a way that recognizes the bias that may be inherent in it in and of itself? And Eric, I'll give you the rest of that.
Yeah, I was just going to note, coming from being a local emergency manager, to me, all disasters start locally and end locally. So the data really has a local, very local flavor to it. But I think we've all seen, just for an example, like in the critical infrastructure database, you look at the federal level, the database, and you look at the local level, and the data may be vastly different. And I think we need to start to not only normalize that, but there's going to be a continual machine learning kind of feed here, because tomorrow we have a new disaster that we haven't thought about, or a new interdependent cascading disaster where it's cyber attacks and natural disasters coinciding together with multiple independent cascading effects. That's where these models and this data will shine. That means being flexible, taking new data in every day, tagging it, finding new data streams, and then new algorithms and ways to interpret that data to make it better.
Awesome.
I'll add to that comment. Open source model isn't mutually exclusive with the idea that you might have as part of that privately sourced proprietary data as well. So you can have an open source model, and I think part of designing the model is identifying what exists and what are those gaps, right? And some of that will drive, data gathering or broker partnerships to access certain data. It's open. Other parts of it, it might be that, look, the best available data is actually provided from a party that could certify their data. And so I want to say that in this model, the intent isn't to create a data certification thing. It's really creating a decision intelligence framework and identify all the inputs, identify the way that data should work together. And there may be some gaps. And this isn't This isn't a microwave effort. You know, we're not going to get a quick solution that solves all the world's problems overnight, but we're going to develop a framework that's toward and unto equity in emergency management. And that's going to be a process I think will evolve over time. But great question. Thank you.
I'd like to add to that, Joel, and I think that's an excellent point. We also need to consider the historical significance of the use of bad data. Much of the history that we've been told about emergency management, its foundation about how we manage disasters, even about the impact of disasters on marginalized communities, a lot of that information, a lot of the data is incorrect. And so if we start building a decision-making model without prioritizing equity, and equity, whenever you begin working in that space, we know that we have to go back and do assessments and validate. And so much of the history that we've been taught in this country, especially around disasters and emergency management in general, is not correct. And so we have to be cognizant of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jancia. So we have time for a few more questions. So here, Deborah, she said, when we think of where the inequity begins, I'm not sure how you're thinking about approaching this. For instance, in many cases, a portion of the solution's bias in emergency management is baked into where people live, what they have access to, and who has access to them, versus who the person is. Neighborhoods are mostly divided by income, for instance, as Sarah points out. Any other thoughts about it from our speakers?
I really think that's the core of what we're trying to get to, because we recognize that these are issues and we don't typically have good answers for how to deal with them. And that's part of this modeling process, is how do we overcome that, or how do we account for that specifically right there? Because absolutely our communities they're segmented by ethnicity, by income, by all sorts of things. And what we do now does not do a great job. And I don't say that to be disrespectful to anybody out there trying to do the work in real time, because people are doing what they can do in the moment. But we have to change what the moment looks like. And so that's exactly the point of all of this. Is I don't know that we have a good starting place, except that we're asking the questions. We're asking the questions of how we recognize these inequities. How do we build them into a model? And part of it is making absolutely sure it's people first and not stuff first, which is a challenge because we're a little bit oriented to stuff. We like to talk about the fact that we're people first, but when you look at recovery and rebuilding, a lot of it is about stuff. It's about rebuilding infrastructure. It's about rebuilding houses, which, yes, serves people, but it's not necessarily people first. And so that's the approach we have to look at. We have to start exactly where you just said, Deborah, because people.
Thank you, Sarah. Amber, yes, the recording will be available afterwards, so we will be able to share it. Okay, so we already answered that. We have a question here. What best practices can you recommend for tech creators and startups that are approaching emergency management for their feedback and the feedback from their community during the design phase?
I'll just hit that quick. Just like we're doing here, you need to engage the community, and you need to engage people in the community who are interested in the technology that you're doing, like Sarah and Shamsia. And I think all of us here have a passion for not only emergency management first, but then, an understanding and a love for technology. Because when you can save a life with an algorithm, it really changes your way to look at things.
Thank you, Eric. So we can get a few more questions, but before we wrap it up and making sure, people have to drop, we want to make sure we encourage you, and we mentioned, and Joel, that we'll be hosting some workshops. We really encourage you to sign up to one of our upcoming Equitable Decision Intelligence for Emergency Management workshops. We have one on Tuesday, October 26th from 1 to 4, and on Wednesday, November 10th from 1 to 4 Eastern. So we'll include that in the chat as well. Thank you, Alexa, for you to sign up as well. And to continue the conversation and stay up to date, we would like you also to join the Equitable Decision Intelligence for Emergency Management LinkedIn group. So you can please share with others who may be interested as well. So we also have that in the chat. And as we mentioned, if you have any questions, if you need additional information, please don't hesitate to reach out to webinar@spanglobal.org. And let me see here, we have...
Hey, Camila, I want to go back to one question I saw. I think we might have skipped over it briefly. Kevin had asked the question, what's the sort of way forward to build this model out? Are we looking at a pilot for jurisdiction? Absolutely. That is exactly the plan, is to conduct some workshops, develop the model, and then we'll be looking for coalition of the willing. Are there some jurisdictions who would like to pilot building out this model and actually using their own data in conjunction with whatever is available sort of out there to actually implement that model and test it and see what we learn from it, right? You can build a model, but it's no good unless you've actually tested it. So the idea is to design a model, work with willing participants at local, state, or federal levels to implement that model through a short duration pilot, learn from that, and then evolve the model. So to that end, we'll be talking about it in the workshops, but if you don't plan on coming to the workshops and you just want to be involved in one of those pilots, you can let us know that as well.
Thank you, Joel. Here, is it possible to also get a copy of the comments section? I wasn't able to note down everyone's contact info and specific comments. Yes, absolutely. We can totally do that. And then Joel, yeah, we have time for one more question, or should we?
Yeah. I see Alan King had a question. Said equity is actually a foundational part of emergency management doctrine. We've promoted planning for medical needs, disabled, access, and functional needs for response since Katrina and Rita. Recovery doctrine promotes providing the services and support needed individually. Equity is now being promoted through BRIC mitigation. So is something missing, or is the problem with execution? I'll put that to our panelists.
I would say that I will stand boldly and say that equity has not been a foundational component of emergency management doctrine. It has absolutely not been that way. When we talk about the whole community approach, many emergency managers still left out major components of their communities. It became a situation where it's us and them, or we and they. So there's a disconnect. You're right, several great first steps and progress has been made for our disability community and access and functional needs post Katrina and Rita, but there is so much left to do. And a part of that really starts with understanding equity and learning more about it. And I'm glad that the BRIC program is addressing equity as an issue, but we are far from where we need to be. And it's going to take all of us working together and in an inclusive approach, inviting historically excluded groups to participate. That's where we're going to really see the needle move in this direction towards equity. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you, Chauncey. So yes, to your point, then something is missing. Absolutely. Great question. And I just want to thank you all again for attending this webinar today. You really have helped us advance this field and have provided valuable insights and asked great questions to move our conversation forward. So we look forward to working with you in the future as this topic progresses. As we mentioned, we really encourage you to sign up to one of our workshops coming up. And hopefully we can see you and your colleagues there. So thank you again and have a great rest of your day.